Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to see everybody. We've just had a little note coming up to say that this session is being recorded. When we come to the questions and answers, if there's some question that you don't want to have recorded, you must let us know, and we will edit it out after the whole session is edited. We will have the same format as we normally do, which will start with some chanting, but we'll do it in Pali. I personally have a preference often for Pali. It just gives historical context to our path of inquiry. I am always very taken by the fact that this is a tradition that goes back over 2,500 years and still relevant today as it was when the teachings first came. And I suppose Pali is like a sort of link. It's probably like a Catholic liking having a mass said in Latin as opposed to the vernacular in English. After the dedication of offerings, we will take the 3 refuges and 5 precepts. Marlon will kindly present the page on your screen. I will then offer some reflections, and then we'll open it up and have whatever sharing people want to do or questions, and we'll see how we go from there. And we'll aim to end around 8 o'clock, so 6:30 to 8 o'clock. So we'll keep the mics muted. You're very welcome to join in. We'll go to the dedication of offerings on page 18. And I'll chant them in Pali, and you can join in as you wish. Yoso Bhagava Araham Samma Sambuddho Swakato Yena Bhagavata Dhammo Supatipanno Yasa Bhagavato Savaka Sangho Tamayam Bhagavantam Sadamam Sasangham Imehi Sakare Hiyataraham Aropitehi Abhipujayama Saruno Bante Bhagava Suchira Parini Bhutopi Pachima Janata Nukam Pamanasa Ime Sakare Dugata Panna Karabhute Patiganhatu Amha Kamdi Garatam Hitaya Sukhaya Araham Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddham Bhagavantam Abhivademi Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammam Namasami Supatipanno Bhagavato Savaka Sangho Sangham Namami. Let's chant the preliminary homage on page 20. Mayam Buddhasa Bhagavato Bhugavaganahamakaram Karamase Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. We go to page 128 and go to the 3rd paragraph, second in Pali, Buddham. To take the 3 refuges. Buddham Saranam Gacchami Dhammam saranam gacchami, Sangham saranam gacchami, Dutiyampi buddham saranam gacchami, Dutiyampi dhammam saranam gacchami, Dutiyampi sangham saranam gacchami, Tatiyampi buddham saranam gacchami, Tatiyampi dhammam saranam gacchami, Tatiyampi sangham saranam gacchami. Go to page 129. We will chant the 5 precepts in Pali and then in English after each one. Anatipata veramani sikhapadam samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from taking the life of any living creature. Adinadana veramani sikhapadam samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from taking that which is not given. Kame sume chachara veramani sikhapadam samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from sexual misconduct. Musavada veramani sikhapadam samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from lying. Surameraya majja pamadatana veramani sikhapadam samadhyami. I undertake the precept to refrain from consuming intoxicating drinking products which lead to carelessness. Imani panchasi dena. Virtue is a source of happiness. Virtue is a source of true wealth. Virtue is a source of peacefulness. Therefore, let virtue be purified. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. We'll sit for about 30 minutes, perhaps a few minutes longer. As you've no doubt heard many times before, it's very important to find a comfortable sitting position. One can obviously meditate or be aware in any position, but it's good to have one which allows you to stay still for a long time. In terms of energy flow, it's really very good to have an upright position. I remember of the beginning of the lockdown period, I mentioned this before, I think I saw a clip of Mr. Motivator from years ago leading a class on fitness. And he gave a very nice little exercise to straighten the spine. You imagine you have an orange between your shoulder blades, and you not only are holding it there, but you squeeze it by bringing the shoulder blades together. Notice what that does to the spine and the front of the chest. Hold it there for 2 or 3 breaths. And then relax, just bearing in mind the body will remember that, and you just feel your posture will feel light and upright, your chest will feel open, much easier to breathe comfortably. Your hands can be on your knees, or they can be cupped one in the other. And the important thing about meditation is not to rush things, not to dive into the deep end, but just notice how you're feeling emotionally, what sort of mind state you're experiencing. Notice the sensations in the body. And allow the body to catch up with sitting still. Sometimes people find that 3 slightly deeper and longer in and out breaths help the body relax, but without collapsing. So you keep your upright position, but just within that upright position, you allow the muscles to relax with each exhalation. Just accepting the mind and body as it is right now. So we use our body as a reference point that keeps us in the present. And if we wander off into some mental journey of the day or what might be happening later, we just simply bring our attention back to the body. Just enjoying the quiet. Enjoying not having to do anything. Not having to be anybody. So right now it's just like this.
Just being mindful of everything that arises. Our breathing, our body sensations. Coming back to noticing if you've wandered away somewhere.
So it's always good to notice the difference between the beginning of a sitting and when one comes out of it. Always an interesting exercise to observe how our perception changes. Just having sat for 30 minutes or so, not doing anything active, proactive, except just sitting and noticing the breath, noticing the body sensations. But just sitting quietly, and suddenly we see things differently. Sometimes, of course, we have a preoccupation of some kind of worry and anxiety, which is persistent and can interrupt a sitting practice. But in most cases, there's a settling down of activity. And that's in fact the whole purpose of sitting meditation, is to slow things down a little bit so that we notice what we're experiencing. Notice our changing sensations in the body. Noticing the change of in-breath and out-breath, inhalation, exhalation. Noticing how our mind kicks off and gets triggered by a memory or an association, and then follows a whole chain of connections far removed from where we actually are physically. And then with practice, with instruction, one brings one's attention back to the present moment. And in fact, that's the key. The present moment is the key. Because we can think about things, but we're going prior to thinking, we're going to the direct, immediate experience of the moment. It's being in the moment that allows us to observe the flow of phenomena that arises and ceases in the moment. And we may have an idea of how we should meditate and be critical of ourselves, pass judgment on ourselves, that I should be doing this or I should be doing that. Damn, my mind's gone off again. Not again. Yes, it's done it again. So there are different types of meditation. It all depends on the expectation that we have, on the model that we have. We often have an idea of how meditation should be because of something we've read or something we've heard. But there is what I would like to call a supreme type of meditation, which is literally just being present to whatever arises. It requires some basic training, some basic mental and physical hygiene in terms of learning how to be still for longer periods of time. But after the basics have been learned, one goes beyond a technique. What we can start cultivating is just present moment awareness. And in present moment awareness, there's no right or wrong meditation. We just notice what we're experiencing. So even if our minds wander off, if we notice that our minds wander off, we're meditating, we're just aware of it. It's when we get caught up in our meditation practice, in terms of the thoughts, and we get caught up in the stream of thought and get lost in it, then of course we're not practicing awareness meditation, we're not being mindful. But there's a beautiful freedom in just learning to pay attention, to practice awareness. It's only when we have an object in our mind of how we should be doing it that we find there's a gulf between what we want to be doing, what we should be doing, and what is actually happening. But if we switch the focus to what we're aware of, as opposed to trying to have an idea of what we should be doing, there's an immediate recognition. And if we trust that awareness, we trust our recognition of the moment, of awareness in the moment, there's a sudden release, a relief. All right, so this is what's happening. Because awareness essentially is quite non-judgmental. Awareness is not a sankhara, a fabrication of some kind. You could say that awareness is a field where these sankharas, these patterns, these complex patterns of thought, feeling, emotion arise and cease. We sometimes read how to do this by taking an observing position, a witnessing position. In the Thai forest tradition, there's this concept of the puru, the one who observes, the one who knows. But even that can be a bit misleading because it's a sense of identity there, the one who knows, I know. There's just a simple knowing of what's happening, of what's arising. And the beauty of this meditation, of this practice of awareness, is that it just recognizes what's happening. So even now, as you hear my voice and you hear the words, you can know that you're sitting, listening to a voice. You might notice how your thoughts are following the train of thought that I'm conveying. You might notice a disagreement or a question coming up. The awareness of all of that takes no effort whatsoever. You're just noticing what you're noticing. Just as I'm noticing what I'm noticing. I'm sitting here talking to a screen in the hope that there's some real people on the other side of the screen. I can hear my voice in an empty room. Aware of my body sitting on a cushion. It's so simple, it's so uncomplicated. There's no effort involved whatsoever. So what's the trick? The trick is in recognizing what's happening. So it's not just being aware, it's recognizing, cognizing, knowing what's happening. And that, of course, leads eventually and results in wisdom, in knowing the now, as opposed to knowing about something. So it's absolutely immediate. There's no gap between one and the other. This state of knowing, this state of awareness, this is not a conventional Buddhist term, but I like to call it an a priori awareness. It's not something that is generated. We arise in awareness. We don't create awareness. It took me a long time to get my head around that one. I sort of bought in with a materialistic perspective that somehow our complexity generates consciousness or generates awareness. And I hear the counter argument that actually awareness is there and we just arise in awareness. I just sort of couldn't get my head around it intellectually, couldn't understand it. But actually, it's true. We do arise in awareness. Because this knowing knows things, but the knowing is just knowing. It's completely empty of anything. It's just spaciousness. And in that knowing, that primary knowing, secondary knowing arises. Our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations, which of course are all arise in dependence on conditions and pass away in dependence on conditions. This whole conditioned realm that we're so caught up in. So the purpose of meditation, insight meditation, is to extricate ourselves from a belief that what we're experiencing has some solidity, has some consistency. It's constantly changing. But there are certain basic things that need to be in place to make this sort of inquiry, make this sort of discovery. We have to be pretty uncomplicated. We have to be pretty straight and truthful to ourselves and to what we're experiencing. We have to be honest. When I say truthful, we have to be honest with ourselves. Because in our awareness, we have all these experiences coming up, and we're inevitably passing judgments, trying to assess them, make sense of them. But awareness practice is not about analysis. It's not about thinking things through in some complex way. It's about seeing what's what. So there is a reflective process involved, but it's not one that dominates or floods the field of awareness. So in some sense, it's quite subtle, but it is essentially incredibly simple. If we pass a judgment on ourselves, whether it be a good or a bad one, we immediately have a whole cascade of sensations, of feelings, of emotions. If it's a positive self-judgment, we'll feel good. And we notice what feeling good feels like. The sensations of warmth, it might bring a smile to our face. We just feel good about the world. But if we have a negative self-perception, negative criticism of some kind, we immediately feel a contraction of some kind. Well, this whole process, whether it be a positive judgment or a negative self-judgment, can be witnessed, can be observed. So our practice of sitting quietly is to cultivate this ability to observe, to notice what's happening. And gradually over a period of time, which is why time is important in the sense that by regular practice, we start gently letting go of the investment we make in a belief or an idea that we're good or bad, that we're doing things well or doing things badly. And we just come back to what is sometimes referred to as bare awareness, uncomplicated by the contents. So truthfulness about what we're experiencing is really, really important. And this is where morality or virtue and ethics come in. Because if we lead a complicated personal life in our relationships with the world, it's inevitable that we will do a lot of cogitating, a lot of thinking, a lot of analysis, a lot of planning. Leading a complicated life absorbs a lot of energy, a lot of attention. We get lost in the minutiae of everyday experience. And of course, if one is untruthful or hurtful to other people in response to hurts that we may have received even, if we're manipulative, it takes a lot of brain power to be manipulative. And it absorbs our attention so that this beautiful quality of open, spacious awareness that we arise in gets completely lost in the bits and pieces of the situation we may be finding ourselves in. So that's another reason why we sit quietly. We withdraw from the world, from interaction with others. We reduce the amount of external stimuli, of data that's coming in order to clear the decks a little bit, see the space, see what's arising a little bit more clearly. The beauty of the Buddha's teaching of starting with morality, with virtue, is that basically it tidies our lives up, gives us an opportunity to put some order and harmony in our lives. It's a bit like living in a room. A room can be messy, all your stuff can be all over the place where you can't find things. When you need them, there's no order. Well, the external space we live in can be a reflection of our inner space. It can be a metaphor for our inner space. So having a virtuous and moral life is like tidying one's inner room up. It allows you to move freely between the objects, relating to the objects in a way where there's a clarity between the space between the objects and the objects that exist in the space. So taking this metaphor of space a bit further, it's like awareness. This room is like just a room of awareness. You can put a lot of things into it. The space isn't affected, actually. It's just full of stuff. But the space itself will remain. Take out the stuff, the space is untouched. But in terms of living everyday life, we're living in a conditioned realm. We have to relate to the objects in the room. So the art is to do that skillfully, to navigate through the situations that we find ourselves in, fulfilling our responsibilities, fulfilling our duties, pursuing a career, earning a living, doing all the things that life puts on us through existing in a society that is this society, not another society. So the question is, how skillfully are we able to move and navigate through this territory? Meditation gives us the tools, awareness practice gives us the tools. We can observe the cause and effect of situations. When we do this, that happens. When we don't do this, something else happens. So there is a reflective process, there is a thinking process involved, but it's not overthought. So in our awareness practice, we come back again and again, just to letting everything go. Not holding on to anything, just witnessing, just being in the process of breathing, sensing, noticing all the phenomena that arises and ceases. Now the thing about awareness is that it's always in the moment. It's nowhere else. When we think about the future, we're thinking about the future in the present moment of awareness. When we remember the past, we're remembering past events, but when are we remembering them? In the present, in the now. So it's very important just to remind oneself, have an internal reference point, that it's always now. So in our sitting practice, our sort of deeper, quiet, silent sitting practice, we can gradually disengage from thought processes, from our thoughts, from our speculations, and just try and go to the heart of the present moment. If we examine the present moment, It has no beginning, it has no end. The present moment is actually quite timeless. Our thoughts arise, and it's our thoughts that create time. We construct time. We remember, we anticipate, and what we remember we organize into a storyline, a narrative. When we sit, we can go into a timeless zone and realize that that empty core of the present moment, what we call it the core, it's empty, there's nothing there. Things cluster around it, but actually at its heart, it's pure and it's empty. That's where we find peace. That's where we find true well-being, which is not dependent on the vagaries of conditions that come and go. There's a saying in the which comes from the Islamic tradition, which is it's an Arab saying which I really like, which is trust in Allah, but don't forget to tie up your camel. It's a beautiful concept because it's about a trusting approach to life. But within that trusting, you don't do nothing. You still have to tie up your camel to keep it safe. You still have to tidy your room up, wash your body, brush your teeth, buy clothes, fulfill your duties. So we do the things that we have to do because of the conditioned realm we find ourselves in. But there is a bigger dimension in which this is all happening, a primary reality, we could call it. And this isn't a matter of belief. This is something that can be known immediately and directly. And every time we know it for what it is, there is an internal reorganization of energy, of well-being. We're designed, as it were, to know the truth. And our path is to explore experience, investigate it, with a combination of trial and error, following certain pointers, certain guidelines, and in the case of the Buddhist tradition, some signposts, some reference points that help us discover what is already true and real, which gives rise to real peace, a real homecoming. So I offer those few reflections for consideration. I don't know if you have any questions that come up for you or you'd like to add to that. I'm sort of honing in on something that is of particular interest because I think it's the heart. Been at this game a long time, over almost 50 years, and it takes a while to sort of filter out all the things one's heard, to actually know things for oneself. Still got a long way to go. But events like this are just a useful opportunity to explore something which is always relevant, because the truth of the way things are is always relevant. There's nothing more important. Everything else is of secondary importance. But finding a state or a sense or an experience of well-being which isn't based on conditions is nothing more valuable. It's priceless. So do feel free to ask questions, either write them down in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to ask questions. And it's always useful to remember that asking a question is often asking a question not just on one's own behalf, but other people may have a similar question. So it's a shared experience. And we'll see how we go. We have about half an hour, 25 minutes.
Hi, Nick. Hi, it's Will.
Hi, Will.
It's a bit dark here. I had a question. And with the current circumstances of lockdown, I've had a chance to read a lot more, listen to talks and so on. And there's, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different types of exercises and pointers. was just wondering, in your daily practice, do you give any, or have you given any structure to the way you've practiced, or do you sort of just, is it, so what I'm trying to say, is there any sort of way of structuring practice to focus on one thing which might lead to something else, which might lead to something else? It's sort of just as it comes and as you feels right at the time.
Well, it's a very good question. I think it really depends on the individual. We have to find our own way of how to practice. Personally, I like to start the day with a sit. I like the lockdown in some respects because the pressure of having to go from A to B is not there anymore, mainly at home. So actually there's much more space. I think having some structure is very useful, very important for most of us, because we need a frame of reference for daily life, I think, is helpful. And monasteries have routines, companies have routines, and individuals can have a routine. I think after a while it just becomes sort of intuitive, but I think it's good to have a basic structure of some kind. Just doing things on impulse is not always very skillful or helpful. It doesn't actually lead to very good results. So having an early morning sit, best time of the day for me. I love sitting in early in the morning, probably the highlight of the day. And even if it's although I don't have that often, one can sometimes have a bad sit or a difficult sit in the morning, but invariably it feeds into the day. Sometimes if there's some big drama affecting one, it's that one's preparing for something. There's a certain amount of anxiety or worry about having to prepare or do something, a situation that one has to deal with. Because we are so hyper aware of anticipating of things that might happen, it's a survival instinct. We have to anticipate to survive. We can't just go through life without some form of anticipation. Sometimes anticipatory anxiety can be quite undermining. So in the morning, if one has a good sit, one can actually experience a lot of that anticipatory anxiety and actually find that a lot of it gets resolved in the sit, which then allows us to deal with whatever we're dealing with in the day much more calmly, much more mindfully and calmly, essentially. So it's not good to judge a sitting, whether it's sort of good or bad. Just the sheer practice of just sitting and being present to whatever's arising with some basic structure is really good hygiene. It's like eating your meal properly, with the right sort of food at the right time of the day. So I think having that sort of structure is good. I think, there are all sorts of the basic things which are, it's taught on a common level. If you're sitting at a computer all day long, that's not good for you. Get up every hour, do some walking. So all that basic stuff, I'm assuming that's sort of already in place. I think one can overdo listening to Dharma talks and sort of scrolling or going through one YouTube talk to another one. It can often be a substitute for one's own practice. So I think dealing with the very basic necessity of everyday life, keeping your place tidy, doing some washing, decorating, tidying up, whatever it is. These are simple tasks which actually can form a large part of the day, as well as the work that one does. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. I think some people like very structured days. I think there should be some flexibility personally, but we have to find our own way as to what works with us. The ultimate test is, what's it like at the end of the day? Is there a sense of satisfaction that one has actually managed one's affairs as best one could? In the Catholic tradition, they have this sort of examination of conscience, who have I hurt? Did I say the right thing? Sort of having a little review is a good thing to do, sort of a reflective process, which works with everything in life, really. Just a review. What's the outcome? And that's sort of like we're self-regulating organisms, and we can regulate our lives in a way that actually is either conducive to harmony, insight, and well-being, or not. And we always know. there's always that intuitive sense, yeah, that was a good day. I did my best. You know? And so appreciating the good and making a determination to avoid what's not good, what's not wholesome.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Hi.
You mentioned about the concept of arising in awareness.
Yes.
And you said you grappled with it intellectually and
yes.
could not see it. And then you said it's true. As in, did the intellectual process lead to you realizing it, or you had to abandon the intellectual process to realize it?
Yeah, very good question. Well, the intellectual process is there because there's something that needs to be understood. So it's a reflection of the search. Because I think in all of us, there's a seeking for truth, happiness, and well-being. People look for it in different places. You know, all of us, most of us, I assume, on this in this class, are seeking it in the field of this sort of so-called spiritual dimension. So the thinking is just a reflection of wanting to know, of inquiry, of investigation. And it's undoubtedly, it's not the driver, it's an expression of a desire to know. And I think if that desire is strong enough and the questions asked persistently, if there's this wanting to know, eventually the answer will come. But when it does come, it supersedes, it sort of, as it were, puts everything into place. And suddenly the thinking is aligned to the knowing. So the knowing suddenly, oh, so this is what it's about. Yeah, I can get it. But it's so frustrating because intuitively we sort of feel, yes, you feel very, very close to it, but you just can't get it. I've read many, many books. I've got more books than I can handle, actually. I don't know what to do with them now. I've got to try and get rid of them in some constructive way. But one book that I had, which actually doesn't come from the Buddhist tradition, was on my bedside table for years. And that was the I Am That by a wonderful Hindu sage, a Advaita Vedanta teacher called Nisargadatta Maharaj. And I found that really perplexing because the conceptual framework is slightly different. It's pointing to the same thing. All truth teachings point to the same thing. That's one thing I've learned. But it's decoding the language. It's decoding the words. It's decoding the concepts. But when you have this inquiry, anything that resonates with that inquiry alerts your attention. Well, that's my attention. But then there is that wonderful moment when suddenly, oh, so that's it. And it's a real feeling of great joy and sense of well-being. And as I said, at that point, there's an alignment of suddenly thought is aligned with a truth which is prior to and beyond thought. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does. Thank you.
you know, in the Buddhist tradition, this inquiry, this investigation, which is the second of the 7 factors of enlightenment. You know, there's mindfulness, being aware, but then there's the investigation into something. In later Buddhist traditions, it's called the bodhicitta, this will, this movement towards enlightenment, which is essentially a desire, a wholesome desire for completion, for fulfillment, for happiness, for well-being. And we're all driven by that, except that people look for it in different places. So people look for it in entertainment, they look for it in drugs, they look for it in sex, they look for it in material possessions. And I suppose if one has tried that, and most of us probably have tried that to some degree, one just realizes that even if we get what we're after, if it's an object, even a refined object, even the nicest piece of music can get repetitive, can get boring. Even the nicest object can lose its attraction after a while, because we have this adaptive mechanism that once we familiarize ourselves with something too much, it just becomes a bit neutral, it loses its attraction. So, spiritual seekers often are people who have tried a lot of things and not found what they're looking for. Which brings us to events like this. But there are some wonderful teachers around. Many years ago, I've been with Ajahn Chah as a student of his for many years, getting on for almost 30 years. And then I can't remember exactly when, but it must be a long time ago, it must be at least 20 years ago, he started speaking about what is real. And I remember that catching my attention at the time. And he made this differentiation, which I've been trying to convey this evening, that the only thing that's real is something that's permanently true, that's always true. And that the unconditioned is real. Awareness is real, but it's not an object. But I was so intrigued by that word real, because on one level we say, well, this is real, my hand is real, my body is real. But I suddenly realized, I just realized, even as he was teaching, that he was trying to point to something which wasn't physical, which wasn't material, which wasn't an object. He was trying to point to something that is absolutely real. And his teaching always brought me and everybody else he was teaching into the present moment. So we'd sit on a retreat. And he never taught techniques of how to breathe or not to breathe. He didn't condemn them, he'd suggest them and encourage them as a sort of basic form of practice, sort of learn the basics of meditation. But every now and then he'd just say, right now it's just like this. And if we really take those words to heart, what are those words pointing to? That right now it's just like this. Accept it, be with it fully. It's just like this. At the moment we do that, it's so simple, it's sudden release. I'm not trying to do anything, I'm just accept right now, it's just like this. The beauty of that teaching, it's not even a mantra, actually, it's a pointing. Because it's always just like this. But what it is will be different from moment to moment, but it's always just like this. So it's like a real anchor in connecting with the present moment just as it is, and seeing what happens as a result of just experiencing the moment in the form, all the reactivity that kicks in. Because if we don't want something and it happens, we immediately get into a state of aversion. Or we have a desire arising, I want it to be different, which is what tanha, craving. So we're immediately confronted with this basic instinctive drive to have things the way we want them to. And of course, that's the cause of our suffering. That's the root of our suffering. That's the first noble truth. And the second noble truth, the cause for it is tanha, craving. Craving for sensual experience, craving for being, craving for not being. So we can, just by coming to that simple first and second noble truth, you're already at the heart of practice. So simple. How many times have you and I read about the Four Noble Truths? It almost becomes like a sort of a background noise, like music. Yes, I've heard this, I know all about the Four Noble Truths. But actually taking on the significance of right now it's like this, is just connecting with this basic immediate experience of the moment and all the reactivity that kicks around, kicks up, gets kicked up into space, into awareness as a result. And then of course that gives cause for reflection, for sort of, oh, what's going on here? So of course that's where the third noble truth comes into play. When the sudden realization of what the mechanism is that there's a moment of suffering. There's the identification of the cause of the suffering, which is desire, craving. And suddenly the realization, so that's it. And at that moment you get cessation of suffering. And this, you don't have to be an arahant to recognize it, because you can have a partial insight on this moment. Suddenly, right, okay, so that's it. And a sudden release, a cessation of suffering, nirodha. Well, that's like a mini enlightenment, mini waking up to a truth. And then through trial and error, one just finds this principle operating all the time. And then, of course, we have the beauty of the Eightfold Noble Path, a phenomenal presentation, which covers the whole spectrum of human existence. Yeah. How the way we think affects the way we communicate and express ourselves. And then we have right speech, right action, right livelihood, all to do with everyday life that we all go through, our relationships, the jobs that we have, how we relate with one another, not only externally, but internally. And then that switching point when suddenly we realize that we can actually develop this understanding. But this understanding develops of its own accord. Sometimes it's wrongly understood, I think, when you I've got to work at it. It's just become sort of obvious that there's something to be attended to, noticed. And that becomes our bhavana, our development. And what's the development? Avoiding things that are unwholesome and cultivating things that are wholesome and maintaining them. So we're getting some parameters. This is where, of course, sila comes in. The parameters of what are the values, what are the judgments that you pass on situations on yourself. And then, of course, there's mindfulness. And in some cases, many cases, some degree of samadhi, when we're able to completely disengage from the phenomenal world and experience very refined states, phenomenal nonetheless, but extremely refined states of consciousness, all linked in with an understanding. So we have plenty of work to do, and it's our task is very clear. And there's no better investment of time and energy than in addressing this whole question of existence, its meaning, and of course seeing ultimately into the emptiness of anatta, which is pure awareness. That's why I like chanting reciting and chanting the 5 precepts, or the 8 precepts from being on a retreat. Because having those precepts as reference points, when we're in doubt and don't know, we just got to stop, pause, and reflect on the significance. So reciting those on a regular basis is just like a reminder of the value system that we're living by. One which is in accord with Dhamma, with the way things are. It's in harmony. And it brings about harmony, internal harmony, and harmony with the outside world. And that just creates a beautiful platform for this investigation, for the Dhamma Vichaya, the investigation into truth.
Nick.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for everything you've said this evening. It's very clear and helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I had a thought that came into my head, which started along the lines of, is it harder to find peace in the city? But I don't think I agree with that myself. I know that I've gone through various changes. All of them have happened in a city. And then I think it's more about the situation and the level of activity perhaps that you have around you within your life at the time. And I was interested, you were mentioning following your duty, and we're all born in a circumstance, and it's going to be our lives potentially that we're just living in that circumstance, and we're hopefully accepting it. But sometimes there seems to be a bit of a paradox between following your duty and the ability to get further on the path, or seeing things more clearly.
And your question is?
Whether you felt that was necessarily the case, or whether there is always a way to identify what it is that is causing the, don't want to use the word obstruction necessarily, but there's a certain, even if you're living according to the precepts and living in quite a well-ordered way in some ways, there is just a level of things when they happen and when they go on that there's always distractions, and so if that's your duty to follow them, how to also make sure they don't distract you from.
I get your question. It's a very good one. It's a very pertinent one. Obviously, we all want ideal conditions to practice in. We have an idea of what is good for us, and some conditions are more conducive than others. But what I've learned is that conditions are not always very accommodating. Sometimes we find ourselves in conditions which are not helpful to our practice. But then that's because I'm passing a judgment on them. What I have learned that sometimes conditions are absolutely awful, but there's the acknowledgement and acceptance that right now it's like this is what I've got to deal with. How do I deal with it skillfully? How do I respond to it? Which is also, in a sense, responding to what is necessary, even if it's something I don't want to be doing, but I know that I should be doing. So it starts moving away from this is how I would like things to be, which is fine as a model, as a working model, but I have to deal with the way things are. It's always that. And then deal with them as skillfully as one is able to. But there's always a tension, I have found, to some degree, between how I want things to be and how they are. And it's narrowing that gap and accepting the situation fully as it is. What is amazing is that some kind of response or answer which is appropriate to that will emerge. It's a combination of thought, combination of intuition, combination of feeling, something which is often beyond our cognitive capacity. How many times, one ends up helping somebody because we know it's the right thing to do, even though it's at our own expense, quote unquote. Because generosity means giving of ourselves, but we have to measure it, do it skillfully. What I can say is that with practice, with application, with goodwill, good sila, with a generosity of heart, things start falling into place quite extraordinarily. It's almost like it goes beyond a calculation. Things start falling into place, and there's this understanding that recognition arises that our mind state in some way is reflected in our environment. It's a very subtle one. I've no idea how a physicist will ever establish this connection. But if something upsetting happens, it doesn't upset anymore. It's a disturbance of some kind, but there's a much more spontaneous, intuitive response to that disturbance, which almost makes it okay. So, in principle, yes, it's nice to have a meditation room, nice to have a cushion, good to have it, all those supportive things. But we have to accept the fact that we're not in control of conditions. What we're in control of, to some degree with practice, is our response to the conditions that we find ourselves in. And that's where the secret of happiness and well-being lies. It doesn't mean just a passive acceptance of situations. In a sense, you could say that there is a sort of rationale to it. If I accept all the data of a given situation, the more data I have available, the more appropriate my response will be based on that data. some of that data that I'm taking on board may be almost subliminal, not necessarily actually identified as specifics on the conscious level. And if we are open to situations, at the same time guided by certain principles of sila, not as abstract ideas, but just a certain goodness, a purity of heart, as I say, out of that emerges a response to the situation which is appropriate to the situation. And in that there is a sense of well-being. So like and dislike become experienced, but don't become dominating factors in one's response. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an attempt anyhow. Right. Well, I'm aware of time. It's 8 o'clock. I'm glad you've all been able to come. Pleased to say that Ajahn Sundara is coming next week. The nice thing about these classes recently is that through one of the benefits of lockdown is that suddenly the nuns are much more available to come and teach. The traveling element is not part of the equation anymore. So Ajahn Sundara will be teaching next week. And I think we've got a bit of a break. And Martin will be teaching. Some of you will know Martin. But we have some, later on in the year, we have some more visits from the nuns at Amaravati. So I think it would be nice to end with a closing chant. It's a bit long. I want to keep the simple one, so we do. Let's just do a reflection on universal well-being on page 41, Marlon. That would be great. And we'll mute everybody, and I will chant it, and feel free to join in. Just a moment of silence, noticing the silence, noticing the stillness in the moment. Now let us chant the reflections on universal well-being. May I abide in well-being, in freedom from affliction, in freedom from hostility, in freedom from ill will, in freedom from anxiety, and may I maintain well-being in myself. May everyone abide in well-being, in freedom from hostility, in freedom from ill will, in freedom from anxiety, and may they maintain well-being in themselves. May all beings be released from all suffering, and may they not be parted from the good fortune they have attained. When they act upon intention, all beings are the owners of their action and inherit its results. Their future is born from such action, companion to such action, and its results will be their home. All actions with intention, be they skillful or harmful, of such acts they will be the heirs. Thank you. And we'll go to page 28. To the closing homage. If you have a shrine, then you can bow to the shrine. Araham Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddham Bhagavantam
Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammam Namasami. Supatipanno Bhagavato Savaka Sangho Sangham Namami. Well, thank you for joining the class. I look forward to seeing you next week again. If anybody would like to say something, feel free to unmute yourself. I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer if you'd like to.
Thanks, Nick. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks,
I'd like
David.
to thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Mm.
Thank you, Marlon, for
Thanks, Marlon.
all your editing and control there, and thank you for your questions.
Mm. It was very helpful.
Good, I'm glad. Right.
Yes, thank you very much. I lost you earlier. I don't think I'm supposed to see one of your talks, you know. Last time you had technical problems, this time I had technical problems. So, but at least I saw half of it this time. So thank you very much for that. That was very helpful.
Good, I'm glad. Bye, Marlon. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
What you mentioned about investigation was quite interesting, because of the 7, I thought I could not understand the word investigation at all. So it was actually insightful to hear about it.
It's a wonderful word. It's Dhammavichaya in Pali. And as I say, it's the second, I think it's the second of the 7 factors of enlightenment. It's beautiful. I mean, it's inquiry. I mean, it's using, you know, using all our natural abilities, including thought. So it's, you know, it's what scientists do, except we're scientists of the heart and of life, you know, examining life, making sense of it, but making sense of it in a way that's in accord with actually the way things are, as opposed to some complex theory which is, you know, one removed from experience. And experience, of course, is where we test things out immediately. So it's a very subjective inquiry, but it's a subjective stroke objective inquiry.
Thank you very much.
Okay, it's a pleasure. Okay.
Nick, I just wondered if you know how Wendy is, if you're in touch with her.
It's a very good question. No, I haven't been in touch with her. Last time I was in touch with her weeks ago. It's a very good point. Thank you. I will phone her and find out. And next week, I'll be here next week with Ajahn Sundara.
Pass on my regards if you contact her.
I will indeed. I'll pass them on. It's very good of you to ask after her.
Thank you.
Last time I spoke to her, she was all right, but it was quite a few weeks ago now.
Okay. Thank you very much for today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.